In northern Italy, Alba, Barolo, and Barbaresco have become wine tourist destinations. How can you make the most of your visit to these regions in Piemonte? Why should you try a Nebbiolo wine from Roero? And why is there so much excitement about sparkling wines in Piemonte now? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in part 2 of our chat with David Way, author of the terrific book, The Wines of Piemonte. You don't have to have listened to part 1 from last week first, but if you missed it, go back and have a listen after you finish this one. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover the funny coincidence David experienced when trying to find Albino Rocca's winery back in the days before Google Maps. What you should know about Gaja wines and the Barbaresco cooperative. How Moscato d'Asti compares to champagne and why it's often undervalued. The differences between how Moscato d'Asti and Prosecco are produced. What you can expect from red sparkling wines of Piemonte, and how much white wine is made in Piemonte and which grape varieties are most common. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 316. 2 of you will win a copy of David's fabulous book, The Wines of Piemonte. All you have to do is email me and let me know that you'd like to win. I'll choose 2 people randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. It doesn't matter where you live. I also still have 1 copy left of the following books to give away: Inspirational Memoirs and Memories of the Women Who Shaped Ontario's Grape and Wine Industry by Jennifer Willem, and Wine Bites, 64 Simple Nibbles That Pair Perfectly with Wine by Barbara Scott Goodman. In other bookish news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook or listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you'd like to give this book as a holiday gift, I'd be happy to send you personally signed book plates, both for yourself and for the copies you give as gifts. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/316. The paperback usually arrives within a day or 2 of ordering. The ebook and audiobook are instantly available. At the end of today's episode, I'm also including a bonus interview I did with Jo Penn on her podcast, The Creative Pen. This is part 2 of our conversation, and we explore how writers engage readers, especially through book clubs, how writers protect themselves legally, and how you can earn a living as a writer. As I said, this is gravy, not the main meal, so feel free to keep listening if you're hungry or thirsty for more, or not. Okay, on with the show. You have a story about asking a man in a local bar in Barbaresco when you were there how to find Albino
Rocca. Yeah.
winery back in the day before Google Maps. Yes.
Absolutely. I was a wine blogger then. I wasn't a professional or anything. And I had decided to visit Barbaresco and had a lovely time. And as you say, first of all, the thing to know is that, in rural life, lots of people have the same surname. There are lots of Roccas, for example, in Barbaresco.
Like
Yeah, exactly. So I can vividly remember going to a village in the Prosecco hills and saying, "Can you tell me how to get to X winery?" And the lady very kindly said back to me, "We're all called X in this village. You'll have to be a bit more specific." So anyway, I went into the bar to ask how to get to this winery. spoke to a guy standing at the bar and said to them, how do I get to the winery Albina Rocca? And he said, oh, it's fine. It's no distance at all from here. Just go down the road, turn left. You'll see the winery on your left, etc. So I think I must have stopped and had a cup of coffee or something. It was obviously a bit early. So I then went to the winery at the appointed time and introduced myself, only to discover that the person I'd met in the bar was from the winery.
That's great.
So I'd actually met a member of the Rocca family in the winery. Yeah, sorry, in the bar, and then met him again.
Love it. Sounds like one of those rural films where the one guy is doing everything in the village. He's the winemaker, he's the postmaster, whatever. But that's great. And then you have another story related to Barbaresco while we're at it. Gaja, who's a famous Italian winemaker, and the Barbaresco cooperative, from 2 generations of how impossible it was to keep up with the sheer physical energy and vitality of Angelo Gaja and his dad. What was that?
So this was amazing. I since come to know the director of the cooperative, the Produttori del Barbaresco it's called. Really great winery, and one that doesn't break the bank in quite the same way that Gaja does. Barbaresco is a tiny village, and literally the Gaja winery is about 100 yards from the Produttori. They are both on the main street in the village, okay? And there is a very strong connection between the two, which I only learnt about recently when I was doing the research for the book. So the Vacca family, the current one is Aldo Vacca, is the director of the Produttori, and his dad was also the director, and they both worked with the 2 generations of the Gajas. I mean, Angelo Gaja is most extraordinary. I've seen him in the States. He's in his 80s now. I've seen him at big events in the States recently. You know, nothing is going to stop this guy.
No, he's so energy. Like, even before I started writing about wine, we did a tour of Italy and we went into Gaja and he talked to our group and he was just a dynamo. It's like, I can't believe you have the time and energy for a tourist bus. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no. So Aldo Vacca told me that his dad, as a younger man, had gone to the States with Angelo Gaja's dad and had really struggled to keep up with him. He would just, every set of stairs there was, he would run up them. He would fit in, crazy number of appointments in the day. And although he was a younger man, he really struggled to keep up with him. And of course, Angelo Gaja also had this reputation that, like you just say, if a restaurant in Germany said, well, we'd like to try your wines, he would literally jump in the car, put the wines in the back of the car, drive up to Germany, show them in the restaurant, and then come back to Barbaresco. He was it is a major brand for a reason. The wines are very, very good, but the family have been absolutely tireless, amazing promoters of their wines. I can remember, again, years ago, going to a tasting in London and being totally charmed by Angelo Gaja. He is just so good at his job, both in terms of supervising the winery and in terms of promoting the wines. I've been there recently, and as you probably know, the next generation is now in day-to-day charge and runs the winery. So I said to, I think it was Gaja, his daughter, I said, well, it's a complicated business, isn't it, running a winery? And, you have these huge strategic decisions to make. And who in the end makes decisions about it? And she just laughed and said, of course, my dad.
He's still in there.
He's still in there. So, yeah, they are a remarkable family.
Absolutely. Remind me a bit of the Antinoris as well, but they're, of course, in Tuscany.
Yeah.
And was there a time when you were made to wait an hour outside a winery, which had been booked without any explanation, something like along that lines? Yes.
Yeah. So again, funny, all these stories happen to be in Barbaresco. Strange things do happen in other places, let me assure you. But yes, of course, writing the book, you have to be very disciplined. I had to visit at least 4 wineries a day. So you had to keep to time. You knew exactly that you were going to be somewhere at 9 o'clock, somewhere else at 11 o'clock. Then, of course, Italians love lunch, as I do. So that's good. And then you'd fit in 2 winery visits in the afternoon, and you'd finish and you'd get back to your hotel at 7 o'clock or something. And so they're long and fascinating days. So I think this must have been an 11 o'clock appointment. And we turned up at this Giuseppe Cortese. I'm not going to tell you who the wine person was, but I will tell you which the winery was. So Giuseppe Cortese, a very important Barbaresco producer. and rang the doorbell at exactly the right moment. And the guy came out and said, "It's really nice to see you. Could you just wait outside for a bit because we're not quite ready?" So I said, "Yeah, of course, no problem." So Janet was with me. It wasn't a huge hardship. It was a beautiful, I think it was like an early autumn day, looking out across the vineyards of Barbaresco. It's gorgeous. And then, 10 minutes passed and quarter of an hour passed, and we began to think this is a bit strange. And then half an hour passed. And then in the end, an hour passed. And then somebody scooted out. I didn't see who it was because the guy from the winery said, "Did you recognize who that was?" I said, "No, I didn't. I didn't really see his face." And he said, "Oh, it's X." I said, "Oh, okay, I understand."
It was a wine critic?
It was a wine critic, very important wine critic. And of course, important wine critics are really important to this business, really important. So I totally understood. And apparently he had been late.
Ah.
So the whole thing, and of course that happens. Somebody else forgets you've got an appointment. They turn up half an hour late, blah, 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 etc., etc. So this happens in a full life, and it keeps us humble. It reminds us that we're not the most important person in the world.
There's always a bigger fish.
There's always a bigger fish. And, we had a perfectly good tasting, and we just had slightly less time for lunch.
Oh, well. The hardships, I tell you. The suffering.
Indeed. I know.
Let's get on to some of the sparkling wines because they don't get nearly enough focus. But Moscato d'Asti, which I think of as a floral, lightly effervescent sparkling wine, often just has about 5.5% alcohol, is also part of Piemonte. Why has it been traditionally overshadowed or undervalued, I think, compared to the Barolos and Barbarescos?
I think that's a really interesting question because, first of all, I think it's an absolutely delightful wine. I think it's beautifully aromatic. Somehow the sweetness works with it. They are pretty much always sweet. And as you say, Moscato d'Asti in particular is low fizz, so, it's not particularly aggressive on the fizz front. And, if you want something to go with a nice slice of cake or a fruity dessert, perfect. And low alcohol. We don't drink as much sweet wine as we used to because so often we're driving and you probably need to worry about your alcohol intake, and therefore a glass of Moscato can be exactly the right thing at an end of a meal. I think there are two problems. I think one is that people disregard it because it's not made in the traditional method, i.e. in a bottle, like champagne is made. So people tend to compare it with champagne or champagne lookalikes and say, oh, well, those are the important wines. And the tank method, which is how you make Moscato d'Asti, is inferior. I would disagree with that because actually I think it is, to use probably another English expression, it's horses for courses. Okay?
Okay.
So if you have a fully aromatic grape variety like Moscato and you want to express that in the glass, then the tank method is absolutely ideal. It is the perfect way of making wine because you don't lose any of those fruit aromas, the floral and fruit aromas. So I think the tank method is ideal. It's not like champagne. It's not as complex as champagne. I would grant you that. It's just different. That's one big problem. The other one is simply that it's not a wine that you keep and age for 20 years. So it's not an investor wine.
So it can't be serious or good by implication.
The implication is that it can't be serious or good, which I think is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Because we need wine, so many different wines for different things, that we can enjoy wines for so many different reasons. And to be honest, a lot of people who are not, deeply into this wine game would find Barolo quite a challenge to start with. They would just think this is truly weird. What are these flavors? Why is this wine so acidic? Why is it so tannic? Whereas you give somebody a glass of Moscato, they'll absolutely love it. A few years ago at the WSET, where I work, I put on a sort of technical session about Asti and Moscato d'Asti. And I put out a general invitation to the company to say, anybody can come along. You don't have to be a wine specialist or whatever. And I thought like 10 people would turn up. In fact, 25 people turned up, which was amazing. And all sorts of people who just love Asti and are not wine geeks. So that's really interesting that it obviously appeals to a range of people. And I think people can be overly snobbish about Moscato d'Asti.
People can be terribly snobbish about a lot of things in wine, but how would you compare Moscato d'Asti to Prosecco, both in the method in which it's made and then the final taste profile?
The second one is easy. The second point is easier than the first. So the taste profile is very different because Prosecco is normally semi-aromatic. It's not fully aromatic in the way that Moscato is. Moscato should jump out of the glass at you. The aromas should really be such freshness and really assertive in a way that Prosecco is very pleasant. I like Prosecco as well. I'm not dissing Prosecco, but it's not as fully aromatic as Moscato. The technical point is that Prosecco is made in a two-stage process. So you make a dry wine first, and then you add sugar, put it back into a tank, and get the bubbles by doing that. Asti and Moscato d'Asti are made only from the sugar that is already in the grape.
Grapes, okay.
Okay, so you never get to the dry stage. You interrupt the fermentation at exactly the right pressure point, sugar, and alcohol for the wine that you desire. So it's sort of like an interrupted fermentation. It's technically a bit more demanding, though once people have learned to do it, they can do it because we have plenty of chemistry. We can measure pressure, we can measure sugar, all those things easy. They can do the maths. So they are very similar. They're both made in a tank, but one is made by interrupting the fermentation. And as I say, all the sugar, all the sweetness in Moscato came from the original grapes.
Yes, and therefore Prosecco, because it's fermented to dryness first, has double or more the alcohol. So it'll be 12, 13, well, probably not 13, but at least 12 and a half.
It'll be 11.5 to 12.
11.5, yeah. Okay, right. So it's definitely higher. And then, of course, just on that continuum, champagne and other traditionally made sparkling wines, that second fermentation to get the bubbles happens in the bottle. The dose or the sugar is added in the bottle, trapped there, and that's where you get the carbon as opposed to in the tank.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So to answer your original question about sparkling wine, the really exciting thing about Piemonte is that it has both styles. It has both tank method and traditional method. And you kindly said in the introduction that I wrote a chapter about the history of sparkling wine in Piemonte, and that was one of the biggest surprises, really, in doing the research, is that I discovered that, so people who know their Italian wine will know that traditional method sparkling wine, I made in the bottle, as you just explained, is typical of two areas, Franciacorta and Trento Doc. And those are the famous ones. Those are the ones that you will see in the Americas, that you will find in most restaurants in Italy. But Piemonte is actually the pioneer of that style. So long before Franciacorta and Trento Doc were created, a guy called Carlo Gancia, when he was 19, took himself off to Champagne, as one does, and learned how to make traditional method sparkling wine in a bottle. And he came back and founded there's a large company called Gancia, which makes sparkling wine of various sorts in Piemonte. And of course, he came back, and of course, he had an immediate problem because he wanted to copy what he'd found in Champagne. But of course, there was no Pinot Noir or Chardonnay in the vineyards of Piemonte. So he did some experiments and tried it with Moscato, and you can taste wines like that today. I don't think it's a really good use of Moscato for the reasons we've already explained. It's better to keep the aromatics rather than, because whenever you do something in a winery, you might add something, but you often take something away. So, if you make champagne, you will lose some of the fresh fruit because you have all those other interesting pastry, hazelnut notes, the tertiary notes, which come through age from within the bottle. So in about 1870, so he went to Champagne in around 1850. In 1870, he discovered that an aristocratic estate nearby was actually growing Pinot Noir. So he bought Pinot Noir from this aristocratic estate and made traditional method sparkling wine. Of course, he called it Italian champagne, which of course you couldn't today. And that was about 1870. So this is way before Franciacorta, Trento Doc were founded and created traditional method in Italy. And then it sort of fell out of fashion, basically. And then after the Second World War, with the creation of inexpensive stainless steel and tanks and all that, we began to see the tank method. And Piemonte made a massive success of it with Moscato d'Asti and Asti, the two very similar sparkling wines made with the same grape variety, made in a tank. And so that became the dominant message. And then in 1990, these 6 large sparkling wine houses in Piemonte, all making tank method, said, hang on a minute, this traditional method is part of our heritage as well. So why don't we start a project to make traditional method sparkling wine? So they started a research project, and basically they planted different clones of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in various vineyards in Piemonte, and then they did microvinifications of those. And eventually, by about 2002, they were ready to launch a wine which is called Alta Langa. So Langa is the name of the area around Barolo and Barbaresco. Alta Langa simply means the higher land above those areas. So the wine is called Alta Langa, DOCG now, and it has to be 90% Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. So it has to be a champagne lookalike, and it has to be made in a bottle. Second fermentation in the bottle, as you explained. So it's really interesting. It's been a significant success. They're up to 3 million bottles now in a relatively short time, you know.
And are they the ones who have mandated for themselves to age the wine 30 months on the lees, on the spent yeast?
Yes, they made two really good decisions, one of which worked perfectly, which is that one, and the other one, which was a good idea, but they didn't quite get it right. So let's start with that one. They said for Alta Langa, the grapes have to be grown at a minimum altitude level. So they then had a big debate about what the minimum altitude level was going to be. And unfortunately, they decided on 250 meters when it should have been more like 400.
Above sea level. Okay, to
Above sea
get it
level.
colder. Okay.
To get it cooler, exactly. That's right. Because you're growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in a pretty warm place. Okay, so you need altitude to bring those
Get the
temperatures
acidity.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And apparently the reason, another grower has told me this, I can't verify it, but it sounds entirely plausible, that there was one of the large companies already had vineyards at that lower level. So they compromised and included them 250 and above. What's happened since then is that people have been planting higher and higher. So they're planting at 450, 500, 550, 600 meters, because obviously the climate has also warmed in the intervening decades. So there's been lots of really interesting planting going on at 600 meters, which I think is really promising for the future. So that was the thing which they had the right intention, but didn't quite get the actual figure right. And as I've already said earlier on, these rules never get changed. It's very difficult to undo the past. The thing they actually absolutely got right, which was extraordinarily courageous, was they said you have to keep it in the bottle for 30 months before you release it. Now, if you compare that to champagne, which is 15 months, and many other sparkling wine regions would be 15 to 18 months. So that is a real commitment, because obviously you can't...
Financially, yeah.
Financially, or you've got a load of wine in the cellar, which you can't sell yet. And that was a really great idea, which means that what does that mean in practice? It means that in practice, every bottle of Alta Langa will have those hazelnut, pastry, toasty notes, which is typical of the style. That was a great decision and, has really paid off.
Great. Oh, wow. And just before, I wanted to do one more sparkling wine, but back to Asti. Did it used to be called Asti Spumante and they got rid of the Spumante part?
Okay, so yes, basically. So now the rules say you can call it either Asti or Asti Spumante.
Oh, you can still use that.
You can still call it Asti Spumante if you want to. Most of it is now called Asti. So there are now two very closely related wines, both made with Moscato, both made from the same region, called either Moscato d'Asti or Asti Spumante. Yeah.
Yes. Keep it simple, folks.
Keep it simple. Yeah, exactly.
Now, there's a red sparkling wine of the region. Tell us about that one.
So it's important to take a step back at this point and say that the old Piedmontese tradition was that many wines would be semi-sparkling. And that could be Barbera, could be Freisa, almost any red grape variety except Nebbiolo. Okay. There are also very aromatic grapes like Bracchetto or Malvasia, which make really good sparkling wine, but they are red. So Bracchetto is probably the most famous of the... none of these wines are well known, let's be straightforward about this, but they are lovely. So Bracchetto is like, if you imagine what a red Moscato d'Asti would taste like, it's just like that.
Okay.
So it's floral, it's very red cherry, it's usually semi-sparkling, it's usually got residual sugar, and it's usually relatively low alcohol, probably more like 7 or 8% rather than 5.5, but lower than a typical table wine. So there is a real tradition of semi-sparkling, or there's even a category called vivace, which means very lightly sparkling.
Because then there's frizzante too, I guess. Is that?
Asti is frizzante. Frizzante simply means less than 2.5 bar of pressure. So it is the bottom half of the pressure range. So frizzante is 2.5 or less. Spumante is 3 or more, but is much more typically 5 or 6. So you end up basically with something that is semi-sparkling or fully sparkling.
And then what would champagne be for comparison?
Champagne
bars?
would be spumante. If it was Italian, it would be spumante. Yeah. It's the same.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
6 bar.
Same. 6 bars. Oh, pressure.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Fully sparkling. Yep.
Okay. Got it.
So they love sparkling wine. They love champagne. I mean, don't tell anybody. If you go to a high-end wine shop in Alba, which is the main town between Barolo and Barbaresco, it'll be 2/3 wines from the region and 1/3 champagne. It's quite incredible how much they love champagne. And therefore, that's partly why Alto Lang has been such a success, because they're saying, actually, we can make a wine which is broadly similar to your wine. Obviously, it's a bit riper. It's a warmer place, but it is in the same tradition as champagne. Yep.
Oh, great. This red sparkling wine, would you compare it at all to the sparkling Shiraz from Australia? Or are they very different?
They tend to be quite different. And that's because with sparkling Shiraz, basically you make a standard still wine first and then make it sparkling. So you end up with a much higher level of alcohol than you would in Vivace, Barbera, or whatever.
Probably deeper red fruit, whereas, as you're saying, the red sparkling from Piemonte is more like a red version of Moscato d'Asti with lighter red fruit. Yeah. Okay.
Lighter red fruit. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
All right. And the whites, we're talking about them after the reds and the sparklings. What percentage of wine made in Piemonte is white?
So this is a really interesting story, and actually one I've only researched since I wrote the book. When there is another edition or whatever, I will be able to add some things. So what I've discovered is that there's a significant trend of increasing the amount of white wine that is made. And it's particularly Arnais in Roero and Chardonnay, Sauvignon, and then a local grape variety called Timorasso, and of course Cortese, which makes Gavi. So Gavi is a well-established wine, but it has increased its plantings in the last 15 years. So it's quite a complex picture in that basically what's happening is that the Piedmontese are making less inexpensive wine. So there's much less cheap Barbera, for example, on the market. And that's simply because social habits have changed. Italians no longer go and work in the fields, most of them. Most Italians will have either a professional job or a job as a mechanic or whatever, and they will drink wine quite regularly as an option. They might drink some other drink, but they might drink wine. Whereas in the past, wine was simply a food substance, like grain or whatever.
Drinking it instead of water, all day long or whatever.
So there was a huge amount of really inexpensive red wine grown in Piemonte in the past, frankly, none of which is missed. It was not great. Those figures have dropped, but interestingly, they've continued to drop in modern times. So there's been about a 15% reduction in black grapes grown by hectares planted in the last 15 years, and about the same increase in white grapes. So that's really interesting. And it's partly because people are drinking more white wine. That's a global trend, not just a Piedmontese one. And I think it's also because they have a very, very good market for their red grapes, for their red wines, but they also want to offer something else. And therefore, they're looking for interesting local white grape varieties to complement the red wines which they already offer. So that's really interesting. And I say I only discovered this about a year ago. I eventually found the source of the data, which tells you exactly what is planted where. And you can see there's 15 years of data. You can see exactly what's happening.
Huh, so you've already lined up your next edition or changes, updates to it. Yes.
Yep.
So you have a wine there with you. Speaking of all this, probably should have asked for it at the beginning so you could like not have to wait so long, David. What is the wine that you have there with you?
So it is somewhat predictably red. I could have chosen a white wine, but I just happened to choose a red. Why did I choose this? It is Nebbiolo.
Okay.
So that was a bit unadventurous because I could have,
Oh, well,
but I thought
you're
actually
on brand.
it's quite difficult because there's so many other interesting red wines, but they're much more difficult to find. So if I recommend Ruquet or Grignolino or something to you, you'll really struggle to find it. Whereas Nebbiolo, you will find any market in the world. So this is a Nebbiolo, but not from a typical place, or at least not from a well-known place.
Okay. Something tricky.
I've already said Alba is the center of the wine trade in Piemonte. And as I've already said, Barolo is 20 minutes in one direction, Barbaresco is 20 minutes in another direction. And then there is a region called Roero, which is 20 minutes north of Alba.
Okay.
Which, incidentally, why Alba is such a good place if you're a wine tourist, because you are between three really important denominations. So Roero is well known for its white wine. It's where Arnais. So Roero Arnais is a pretty well known wine, which, particularly since about 1990 has done really well in the world. And as I've already said, has increased its plantings even in the last 15 years. What people don't know about Roero is it's also a very good source of Nebbiolo wines at much lower prices. Okay, so this is about because obviously Barolo and Barbaresco have become, quite expensive wine. I mean, some
They're
of them are
brand
super.
names. Yeah.
Some of them are super expensive, and then below that, there's a great band of fantastic wines, which if you put it in, sorry, I'm going to do this in pounds, like 35 to 50 pounds a bottle.
Okay, so double that for Canadian dollars.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's some fantastic wines from Barolo and Barbaresco in that price range. You don't have to pay 250 to get a great wine. However, if you go to Roero, you are going to be right at the bottom of that band. So you're going to get a really great wine at a really good price. Now, my friends in Roero always get cross at this point, and I have had this argument with them, and I know exactly what they did and why they did it. Sadly, I just think they made a mistake. So if you look at the bottle, and I will show you the bottle. So don't worry about the vineyard name and all that at the moment. So underneath it says Roero DOCG, doesn't it? Can you see the Roero in white? Yep.
Barely, yes.
Barely. Yes, okay. I'll put it
Yeah.
a bit
Oh, that's
closer.
fine. Yeah.
Is that better?
Okay.
So Roero. Yep. Now, if you went into a wine shop and saw Roero like that, unless you are a Piedmontese wine geek, you would have no idea what was in that bottle.
You wouldn't know the grape, yeah.
You would not know the grape. And their argument is, well, we want to be like Barolo and Barbaresco. We want to be known for our place. And I'm saying to them, fine, except you have to understand that nobody's going to know. And the weird thing is, they did call their white wine Roero Arnais. So you can tell exactly what the grape variety is from the front label. I just think it was heart over mind. Just didn't think that one through. Anyway, they didn't put it, but that's fine. Anyway, what it means is that real bargains to be had in Roero from the Nebbiolo grape variety. The style is slightly different because Roero has got lots of sand. It has far more sand in the soil than Barolo or Barbaresco. So you don't get quite the enormous body that you get in Barolo wines, which actually might be a good thing. They're more accessible. This is a Reserva and probably comes from a relatively clayey site. So actually it's quite similar. But it's a beautiful wine, and just to prove that it does age, this is 2014 in the glass.
Ah,
okay?
Oh, great. Yeah.
Beautiful deep colour still.
It is, very much.
It's got all those things I was waxing lyrical about earlier in terms of what it smells like. So it's got those floral notes. It's got that lovely ripe red to slightly black fruit. It's got some of that tarry, earthy complexity of aged Nebbiolo. So I think it's a gorgeous wine. And yeah, good value, and it's just worth knowing the name of Roero to know that you can get very good Nebbiolo from that place.
Well, we'll put that in the show links as well. David, the time has flown. This has been fascinating. I've found this great, almost like a compact course on Piemonte, so it's wonderful. If you could share a bottle of wine with anyone outside the wine industry, living or dead, who would that be, and what would the wine be that you'd open?
So I said to my wife before she went out this evening, I said to her, I don't know the answer to this, and she's bound to ask me. And then I said, and I wasn't joking, I said, of course I'd share it with you. I said to my
Ah,
wife, and she went, oh. And then she said, yeah, but you can't say that. So I said, okay, I'll think again. So I said, actually, I'd like to share. This is a slightly odd choice because this person is very much alive and he is an English wine writer, but he does live in France. So I don't see him hardly ever. So Andrew Jefford is a very marvelous wine writer. And why would I want to share this bottle of wine with him, whatever it turned out to be? Because I just think he has an amazing facility with words, which most of us, I just do not have. Some of my colleagues at the WSET get cross with him because he uses a lot of analogies. He uses a lot of. He's quite a poet. He does actually write some poetry as a lot of like a hobby. I think we struggle in what I struggle, and we struggle in wine to actually convey this amazing experience. And I think Andrew does it better than anybody. So that would be the reason why I would share the wine. What would the wine be? I would choose something a little bit more off-piste, like one of the great white grapes of Piemonte, which actually has begun to be known a bit better. It's called Timorasso, and it doesn't come from anywhere near Barolo or Barbaresco. It comes from an hour and a half away towards the east, towards the border with Lombardy. And it's one of those amazing white grapes. It's very full-bodied. It's very neutral when it's young. So you really have to put it away for 5 to 10 years. And then it develops into a sort of version of Riesling. Those amazing hydrocarbon, the petrol, the diesel notes, all those things. And so it develops real complexity and interest with a bit of bottle age. And I'd just love to know what he would make of it and how he would describe it.
that would be fascinating to hear him talk about that or any other wine. As we wrap up, is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention, David?
Yeah, let's just talk about wine tourism for a moment, because we haven't talked about that, have we? So yes, Alba and Barolo and Barbaresco have become real wine tourist destinations, absolutely properly, because they are, it's a beautiful landscape, amazing wines, incredible cuisine. What are you waiting for? It's just, they are fantastic places to visit. And it's become very smart of late. You can see that it's been very successful. So there's lots of lovely little, Michelin-starred restaurants. There are lovely small. There aren't big hotels, but there are lots of lovely boutique places to stay. There are inexpensive places to stay. The food and wine scene is never going to be cheap, because it's super high quality, but it is really worth it. The one bit of advice I would have is, if you have any more time, do go somewhere else in Piemonte as well, because it is so easy just to stay in the Langhe, in Alba, and not go anywhere else, and not taste, the great Barbera wines, which are only like 50 minutes away, or that white Colli Tortonese Timorasso, which I just talked about, which is an hour and a half away, or even the Nebbiolo wines of northern Piemonte, which are 2 hours away. So my bit of advice would be, of course, go to Alba, have a great time, but do schedule a couple of days to go somewhere else as well. And of course, you'd have the perfect guide to all
Yes,
that in
yes,
here.
the Wines of Piemonte. Congratulations again on this book, David, and how much it's been lauded to in the press and the awards. And just a reminder that two of you can win a copy of this book, but the rest of you should all go and get it from Académie de Vin. We'll put the link to academydevin.com and to David's books. You're at winefriend.org, Wine Friends?
Yes, so that's my personal website. Yep.
Okay.
I'm on Instagram simply as David Way Wine, for example. I'm on Facebook. But yeah, the principal place is winefriend.org.
Winefriend.org. Great. And Académie de Vin. Well, David, thank you so much. Real pleasure talking to you. Again, this has been a marvelous education in Piemonte. I want to go, and I'm thirsty now. I want to actually go down to my cellar and dig out a Barolo or something, see how it's doing. But thank you so much for sharing all of this with us.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. I feel it's such a privilege to have written about such a great region and to have learned so much in the process. And I love sharing with people. So thank you. Thank you, Natalie. It's been a real pleasure.
Your passion is evident. I'll say goodbye for now. and look forward to sharing a glass with you in person sometime.
Indeed.
Okay. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with David. Here are my takeaways. In northern Italy, Alba, Barolo, and Barbaresco have become tourist destinations. How can you make the most of your visit to these regions in Piemonte? David notes that Alba, Barolo, and Barbaresco have beautiful landscapes, amazing wines, and incredible cuisine with lots of lovely small Michelin-starred restaurants. There are also boutique hotels that are relatively inexpensive. While it's easy to stay in the Longa, David advises venturing outside this region and tasting great Barbera wines or the white Colle Torrontes, which is just an hour and a half away. Number 2, why should you try a Nebbiolo wine from Roero? David explains that Alba is the center of wine trade in Piemonte. Barolo is 20 minutes in one direction, Barbaresco 20 minutes in the other, and then there is a region called Roero, which is 20 minutes north of Alba. Roero is known for its white wine. What people don't know about it is that it's also an excellent source of Nebbiolo wines at much lower prices. Barolo and Barbaresco have become quite expensive because they're brand names now. However, if you go to Roero, you're going to get a really great wine at a good price. And number 3, why is there so much excitement about the sparkling wines of Piemonte now? David says Piemonte has both tank method and traditional method sparkling wines. It was one of the biggest surprises in doing the research for his book. Traditional method sparkling wine made in the bottle is typical of 2 areas outside Piemonte, Franciacorta and Trentodoc, but Piemonte is actually the pioneer of that style. So long before Franciacorta and Trentodoc were created, Carlo Gancia took himself off to Champagne and learned how to make traditional method sparkling wine. He came back and made that wine and called it Italian Champagne and created the traditional method in Italy. It fell out of fashion, and then, after the Second World War, with the invention of inexpensive stainless steel tanks, it regained popularity. Piemonte has had massive success with Moscato d'Asti and Asti, the 2 very similar sparkling wines made with the same grape variety and made in a tank. However, in 2002, the sparkling wine houses of Piemonte launched a traditional method sparkling wine called Alta Langa. It's been a significant success in a relatively short time. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with David, links to his website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 184, go back and take a listen. I chat about Prosecco's success story and snob disdain with Stevie Kim of Vin Italy. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Prosecco is more approachable for newcomers. There's a little bit more residual sugar and the acidity isn't as high. It is absolutely the number one driver for Italian wine.
Yeah, it's a real engine, just as ice wine was for Canada. It's where people can come in and understand it. It's bubbly and it's tasty. It's definitely still a very strange love-hate relationship between consumers and connoisseurs. Do you see Prosecco continuing to gain in popularity in the next 5 years?
I do believe so, especially because they've come up with Rosé Prosecco. I mean, how smart is that?
You won't want to miss next week when we chat with Chris Ruland, author of the award-winning Press for Champagne, a guide to enjoying the world's greatest sparkling wine. He'll join us from his home in Austin, Texas. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell a friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the wines of Piemonte. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie McLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or if you'd like to win one of the books I mentioned in the intro, one of 2 copies of David's book, or if you're reading mine or listening to it. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well about this episode. Were you surprised about the sparkling wines of Piemonte? Are you hoping to visit this region someday? Have you visited? I'd love to hear from you. Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. And that's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/316. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a zesty sparkling wine from Piemonte.
For people listening, unfortunately, this is something that this happened to you and you did make a mistake, but as you said, it was not legally a mistake, and the reaction happened and all that happened to you. And now I think people are like, well, why would I ever do this? Why didn't you at that point give up? You could have, you're a highly educated, intelligent woman. You could have got a job again doing something else. So why didn't you walk away from the whole thing?
Well, first of all, I'm very stubborn. Second of all, I'm a collapsed Catholic, so I believe in suffering makes you stronger. So, but beyond that, I did ask friends and family. I had some conversations saying, should I just go back to high-tech marketing? But I left high-tech marketing because there was so much sexism. And then I land here, and it's like, oh dear, I just left Brave New World, this high-tech world, move fast, break things, stumbled into Downton Abbey, but there's a different brand, a different blend of sexism here. But one friend asked me, well, you love what you do. You've worked at it now for, at that time, 13, 14 years. Are you sure you want to walk away from that and go back to a corporate job? I thought, God, no, that's not me. I'm too feral for an office, and I love what I do. So why wouldn't I continue? But it was very scary because, at the time when you're in the middle of a maelstrom, you don't know what's going to happen. You can't see the future. You don't know if you're going to get sued or something's going to happen. What's going to happen? But you have to kind of take a breath, come back, lean on friends and family, advice. I was in counseling at the time. I remain in counseling. I'm a big proponent of therapy. And you have to get back to, why did I do this in the first place? Why did I start writing about wine? I love writing, and I love the sensory engagement that wine brings me. So has that changed? No. So why should I leave? Yeah, even though it feels like it might be safer at the time, but it's not.
Yeah. I mean, it's not at all what you went through, but several times over the last few years, I've had the sort of attracted the hate for my stance on AI. And I have at several times said to Jonathan, my husband, I think I'm just quitting the whole thing. I mean, screw this. Yeah. And then, as you say, the part of the community that are like, no, this is valuable and we want this, it becomes part of why you stay. And also, as you said, I love what I do as well. And I love writing books, but I also like technology and learning things. And so why should you give up? And also people forget, right? So this is the more relevant question for people listening. How are things for you now? And how do you protect yourself and potentially try and stop these things from happening?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you do what you do, Jo. I mean, I just love following you all about AI. And, unfortunately, those of us who are on this planet today evolved from probably the most paranoid, ancestors who were always searching the environment for what's wrong. And so that's our negative bent, because that's what helped us stay alive and procreate. So we are the progeny of the most worried people on the planet. So we're going to notice the naysayers and the negativity, but you have to kind of, again, step back after you block and walk and realize there's just so much more positivity. That's, so many more supporters. So, in terms of now, I've had the benefit of, this has been a decade since this happened. And as memoirist Glennon Doyle said, write from a scar, not an open wound. And, my family at the time said, well, okay, you've done the healing. Why would you bother to write about this? Aren't you just opening the scar? And I said, well, I love Thomas Doherty, Irish poet, who said, why bother to write about it? Because there is someone somewhere right now who has a wound in the exact shape of your words, which I love. And so that's why I shared the story, but that's why I'm also able to share the story. I've had the telescoping of time, the lens to pull back and to make the reflections on what happened 10 years ago from a place of being healed, so it feels safe. And it's those reflections that are useful to readers. So, no one wants a misery dump for a memoir. They want to know not just what you did, but what you did with it, so that they can apply that to their lives. If they're in a professional crisis or a personal meltdown with a relationship. So that's why I'm able to do it now. And then in terms of safeguarding my health, well, I work out with a fabulous trainer you recommended to me. I love him.
Even though I'm in the UK and you're in Canada, we have the same personal trainer.
We do. I do it remotely. Obviously, I'm not flying over to Bath once a week. I learned to say Bath correctly, too, on the last podcast. But so physical health, exercise, sleep, diet, but also mental health. I continue in therapy. I love it. Like, it's just, we're never finished with who we are. And just the safeguards I put for myself online, a lot of blocking, a lot of deleting comments, whatever, because that's your daily mental stream that's in there. And you have to protect it.
Yeah, well, another tip for people, for a while, I outsourced my inbox because I just couldn't, I get a lot of email. And at the time I was getting a lot of email that I didn't want to see. And It was hurting my brain. So for about a year, I did outsource my inbox. And then that person triaged and then sent me the emails that were nice or that I could respond to.
That's great.
Yeah, so that actually helped. And I think perhaps that's a crisis management tip because I don't use that anymore. After a while, that kind of died down. And so I was able to sort of take it back. But I mean, you're on TV and you're visible and you're on social media. So do you have, you've set your boundaries. So you only share certain things. Like, give some advice around that.
Sure. So when I go on TV, it's all about, wine and fast food or wine and turkey for holiday dinners. It's pretty happy topics, other than when I was talking about my book, which does, again, have a lot of humor. I'm painting it as this really dark story. But in terms of boundaries, I guess, I am public. I am out there. The memoir is very personal, but it's what I've chosen, where my boundaries are. And, in the memoir, I did change the names of my family, because I wanted to protect their privacy. And sure, someone who's really diligent can Google and try to figure out who everybody is. But, so I have set up those boundaries. But just a side note that writers might like to hear on this bit about changing names. At first, I didn't want to use the real names for all of the trolls online. And so I changed all their names because I thought, don't give trolls oxygen in your book. But then once one of the lawyers read the book, he said, well, that if you quote what they're saying from statements online and you use a pseudonym, you're violating their copyright.
Oh, no.
Oh my, this is just too height of irony. But then in the end, by the end of writing the book, I came to the full, deeply peaceful conclusion that they deserved full credit for what they did and said. So I used their real names.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. That's great.
Anyway. Yeah, so that's basically what I do, is try to, have some boundaries in terms of, like, I don't expose where I live or real names of my family. There are just some things that just are good safety protocols.
So another thing I wanted to ask you about was you sent me this extraordinary book club guide and it's got wine pairings for the book and it's 54 pages. And when you sent it to me, I thought, I'll just open this. I'm sure it's just a list of questions, which is what I do for book clubs, which is, here's 20 questions that you might like to explore. And you do that, but you've basically written a whole book for a book club. And this fascinates me. So what are your tips for engaging with book clubs and how do you reach them? Because you clearly didn't make this for no reason.
Right. The evolution of that was at the end of each chapter in the memoir, I was recommending wines that kind of tied into the themes. But for two reasons, my editor and I decided to eliminate that and put it into this book club guide. One was, are you down and depressed getting divorced? Here's a wine for that. It's like, okay, that's not the message that I want to send. The other thing is it became too long. So 54 pages, 13,000 words in this little book club guide. We removed that because the length of the book was too long. So it comes in at 75,000, which is a typical, soft paperback at 300 pages, I think it is, or just under. So that made it the right length. So that's where this first developed. I didn't sit down to write a 54-page book club guide, but it worked as a standalone, I think, because it does go chapter by chapter. It gives you a wine. It asks you chapter-specific questions, but it tries to go, or I tried to go beyond that because, again, a memoir should be relevant to the reader and get them talking about their own lives and what they can draw from the book. So it asks questions like, do you feel that wine is marketed to women differently from men? How do you feel about your own relationship with alcohol? Did it change during the pandemic? And so these are all questions that can spark discussion for book clubs, especially when members don't read the books, which I've heard happen sometimes. But also, it was interesting because it came back to me through people emailing and direct messaging that like a husband and wife or husband, wife would read it together and use the book club guide as a way to talk about those issues between them, or daughters and mothers and so on of drinking age were using it in that way. So I thought that's great. The marketing to the book clubs has been mainly through the front and back pages, or front and back matter as we call it. So at the beginning of the book, there is a QR code and a URL that if you scan it, it will take you right to the book club guide. So that's winewitchonfire.com/guide. And then it's there again at the back of the book. That's the greatest marketing that I did for this book club guide. And of course, you're collecting email addresses. They can unsubscribe anytime they want. But that's how I heard from a lot of people. And then I also put at the back of the book, email me if you've spotted a typo or just want to ask a question. I had so many people, like there weren't a lot of typos, but I know people love to email about typos. So I got a lot of emails that way. But I'm just trying to seek out engagement with my readers because I want to take them on the journey with me. I'm not as prolific as you are, Joe, but I do believe that one of the key success factors for marketing any book is an email list. I'm on social media, but the majority of my effort is through my email newsletter, because you've got that one-to-one conversation, not on rented land, as we all say. But that's been the major thing. Now, I will try to seek out, like when I hear there's a book club reading my book, I'll offer to go on Zoom, join their meeting. But I get a lot of people, like a lot of book club members who read the book on their own and then recommend it for their book club just because it has such a big discussion potential. And then they discover there's a book club guide that will help them not only organize the discussion, but also the wine tasting, which is, again, the reason why a lot of book clubs meet in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's genius. And I think we should all try a bit harder, I think. I certainly felt like, I should try harder with that because I've tried to go to a book club, but I just couldn't get involved with that. I'm not a very groupie type person. So I think because I haven't been part of them, I haven't paid enough attention. But reading your guide, I was like, okay, this is great.
Thank you. Book clubs aren't for everyone, but I do want to, and if anybody's listening that does interact with a lot of book clubs, I would love to hear their suggestions, because for my next book, I do want to write a book that's specifically for book clubs, but I'm still trying to get my head around it, with wines to taste. But most book clubs are very proprietary as to which books they choose to read. So I'm trying to think, well, where would a book for book clubs that's recommending wines and maybe some books on the side, where would that fit in? But anyway, so that's just an open invitation. If anyone wants to contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com, I'd love to hear your suggestions.
No, I think that's great. And I wanted to just move into the business side for a minute, because you mentioned there you're not as prolific as me. I don't think that's true, because you write freelance articles, you write for your website every day. In terms of number of words written, I think you outstrip me like a lot.
I definitely outdrink you, but I don't know.
But you have a business around writing and wine. So it's not just the book. So could you talk us through your multiple streams of income? Because I think that's really interesting.
Sure. So the first one would be online wine and food pairing classes. So at nataliemclean.com, you can find the wine and food pairing classes I offer. I have an in-depth course because food seems to be less intimidating for people to get to know wine. You know, a chicken is a chicken. It doesn't have a vintage chart, whatever. So I bring people in that way. But also, those who know a lot about wine, sommeliers and so on, also take the course because a lot of sommelier courses and so on, surprisingly, don't have a heavy food and wine pairing element to it. And it's just a lot of fun. And people get to know each other from around the world. So that's stream number one. Stream number two is subscriptions to my wine reviews. Every 2 weeks, there's a new batch of 100 wines that come out in our liquor stores here. Our provincial liquor store is the second largest purchaser of wine in the world. So it's a huge chain. So a lot of the reviews are relevant to other regions, countries, and so on. I review wines from all over the planet. That'd be number two. Number three is advertising on the website. The books. What else? I get paid some honorariums for TV appearances, some not. And then I also do speaking. So lately, it's been a run of teachers' organizations wanting me to speak to them. My mom was a teacher for 32 years. My grandmother was an English teacher. I taught Highland dancing, so I'm loving these groups. It's a variety of topics from marketing wine to women to make your dumpster fire your superpower, getting stronger through resilience after you've struggled through something, all those kind of topics.
And this is so important because nonfiction books in particular, having an ecosystem around the book is where you can make more money. And then just finally, you've got your Unreserved Wine Talk podcast, and I've been on that talking about blood vintage, which was great. But I know how much work podcasting is. So why did you start the show, and how does podcasting fit into your book marketing and your business?
Well, I am a listener first. In fact, I don't know if I've read a physical book for a long time. Even when you sent me the PDF, I put it up into Adobe and got it to read it to me.
Oh, great.
Yeah, that's how I consumed blood vintage. So I'm listening to podcasts all the time. I listen to audiobooks. I'm an audio learner. Even before podcasts, the rise of podcasts, I had a shortwave satellite radio, and I would listen to the BBC at night because that's when the reception was best. And these voices, these lovely British voices, would sweep in and out over the ocean, depending on how clear the night was. And I loved listening to those. Perhaps it goes back to when my mom used to read me stories at night, and just hearing her voice read The Wizard of Oz and putting my hand on her forearm and feeling her strength, and the words were in the air and then coming into me. I love all that. I love audio. So I decided to start the podcast I actually made a few attempts in 2008, but the technology just confounded me. Then I started officially near the end of 2018 and got it up and running. And it was an excuse for me to be nosy and ask impertinent questions to people in the wine world, people connected to the wine world. It's not just winemakers. I interview authors like you. They tend to be wine authors, but sommeliers, cheese people, chefs, anybody, but it's all about the storytelling. So it's very much similar to what I do in my books. It allows me entree into someone else's life to ask the questions that I hope that my listeners, readers would want to ask, but might be too afraid to or don't have access to this person. That's what I'm trying to do on Unreserved Wine Talk.
People who think about starting a podcast, it's like, does it help me sell books? Does it promote my brand? Does it make me money? Because it is a lot of work, or you might pay other people to do that for you. So does it fit business-wise as well?
I think it does. There's a bit of irrationality, like I love to do it, so I'm going to do it. But I do think that it is like having a 100-hour conversation with someone. They get to know you pretty well because I don't just launch into the interview. There's always a preamble where I'm talking about something perhaps more personally, like you do. I love those bits and pieces, what's happening in your life. It makes me feel connected, makes me feel like I really do know you, Joe. I think people love that. Like it's very intimate, beside your ears. But so the business case, though, I know that I have purchased online courses after consuming hundreds of episodes of somebody's podcast. And while I don't have sophisticated enough tracking, I do believe in the power of podcasting. Not only is it intimate, but people, the stats are amazing. People will listen to you for 30, 45 minutes, sometimes longer, whereas it's considered a win on Facebook or YouTube to get, a 5-10 second watch of a video. I mean, it's just so engaged. It's an engaging medium, but those long-term, deeply committed listeners are often also long-term committed readers, whether they're reading a physical book or listening to it. So I do think there's quite an overlap. I hope that the tools get better for measuring it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there will never, ever be tools for podcast listeners' conversion because, as you say, someone who maybe has listened for months doesn't buy anything, and then one day they will when they're ready. Or I have people come back now, like people are like, oh, you're still here, you're still podcasting. I listened to you like 5 years ago, then I gave up on my book and now I'm writing it again, and they've come back. And
exactly.
So I think for both of us, I think podcasting is very valuable. And in saying that, we're out of time. So where can people find you and your books and your podcast online?
Awesome. So you can find me at nataliemclean.com. or winewitchonfire.com will take you to nataliemclean.com. And then I'm on all the social media channels with my name, but my primary hub is nataliemclean.com. And you can get that book club, that reader guide, winewitchonfire.com.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, Natalie. That was great.
All right. Cheers, Joe. Looking forward to that glass of wine or two in person next time.
You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.